In reaction to the Allied D-Day landings in Normandy, the Germans had put up such a stubborn resistance that gains were measured in yards rather than miles. However, this later worked to the Allies' advantage, because when the German lines cracked from lack of reinforcements, they broke wide open, and Lieutenant General Patton's Third Army poured right through. After almost 2 months of continuous fighting in Normandy, along with the pressure from the Russian and Italian fronts, the German army in France had finally run out of local reserves. This began the pursuit phase. Patton's Third Army swept through France and in the process outran their supplies. Third Army consumed 350,000 gallons of gasoline every day. On August 28th, Third Army's gasoline allocation fell 100,000 gallons short of requirements. 3 days later, Third Army received no gasoline at all. Patton's troops captured some gasoline from the Germans, hijacked some from First Army, and received some gasoline by air, but despite Patton's desire to aggressively advance, there simply wasn't enough gasoline to go around. Reluctantly, Third Army had to halt for 5 days to replenish and stock up on supplies for further advances. To further compound operational problems, there was a shortage of ammunition, particularly in the larger artillery calibers that hadn't been in great demand during the pursuit. When operations became more static, there wasn't a way to build up ammunition stocks because all available trucks were carrying gasoline. By September 10th, Third Army's artillery batteries received only 1/3 of a unit of fire per day. Other shortages would crop up as the campaign progressed. At one time or another, almost everything an army needed would all be in critically short supply. As if this wasn't bad enough, 19th Tactical Air Command, which had followed Third Army across France, was of limited use due to poor weather and being partially reassigned to assist the battles being waged to reduce the German fortresses still holding out along the French coast. The Germans had not been sitting idly by. They used the short operational pause derived from the Allied gasoline shortage to quickly gather every unit they could lay their hands on to stabilize the front. Wehrmacht stragglers were rounded up, and a good deal of reorganization was going on behind the German lines. At this point in the war, Adolf Hitler was busy dreaming up his future Battle of the Bulge counterattack, but for the German commanders on the ground, it was simply a matter of identifying the likely places that the Allies would attack and getting the best terrain and tactical advantages that they could. The Germans anticipated that Nancy would be attacked and positioned the newly created 553rd Grenadier Division in the city and in the surrounding area. Although unfortified, Nancy was protected by good defensive terrain and, most importantly, by the Moselle River. The Germans were so desperate to stabilize the front that they transferred the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division from Italy, where fighting was still ongoing. This is not the same 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division that was annihilated in the Stalingrad pocket, but it was German policy to recreate destroyed divisions in some cases. This division had some personnel who had murdered 22 Italian civilians while fighting near Naples. To round out the German defense, there were assorted other German units in the area, like a Panzergrenadier regiment detached from 15th Panzergrenadier Division, an airborne infantry replacement and training regiment, and an ad hoc regiment of Luftwaffe anti-aircraft units. The focus of attention in September was on 12th Corps, commanded by Major General Manton S. Eddy. On September 5th, Third Army received just enough gasoline to resume its advance. It only had 2 divisions immediately available, 4th Armored and 80th Infantry Division. Over the past few weeks, the American Army had gotten used to chasing down the running German army. American officers should have realized that sooner or later, the Germans might turn around, dig in, and fight back. 80th Infantry assigned its 3 regiments each to 3 crossing sites across the Moselle River to attack and hold. The plans for September 5th would be for the 4th Armored Division to push through the footholds gained by the infantry and sweep around the German flank from the northernmost crossing site and attack Nancy from the east. The 319th Infantry Regiment would attack Nancy from the west at the same time. This was not the most imaginative plan. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, the 80th Infantry Division didn't conduct adequate reconnaissance nor use preparatory artillery barrages. The Germans were at all crossing sites in strength and dug in on good defensive ground. At each attack point, the Germans held the dominating ground and could not be dislodged. The American bridgeheads collapsed, and the survivors fell back to the west bank. Noticing that the German resistance had stiffened, Major General Eddy knew he had to make a new and better plan. 2 days later, the situation had started to improve for 12th Corps. The U.S. 7th Army was rapidly approaching from the south, and 15th Corps was returning to 3rd Army to guard the southern flank. This freed up the 35th Infantry Division, which had been guarding the southern flank, and made it available for the next assault. Lieutenant General Patton and his superiors remained convinced that the war could be over by the end of 1944. On September 10th, 12th Army Group ordered Patton's Third Army to advance on a broad front and seize crossings over the Rhine River around Mannheim. To achieve this, Patton decided to use 12th Corps to take Nancy, while at the same time U.S. 20th Corps in the north was tasked with capturing Mace.
You see what's sending out them negative waves, did Moriarty?
Hey, that ain't my fault, oddball. I've done nothing but have good thoughts about that bridge ever since we left.
According to the World War II version of U.S. Field Manual 17-100, it stated, "The Armored Division is organized primarily to perform missions that require great mobility and firepower. It is given decisive missions. It is capable of engaging in most forms of combat, but its primary role is in offensive operations against hostile rear areas." During its fight across Europe, 4th Armored Division had perfected the organization and procedures that would ensure the success of its engagements. Through experience, a close cooperation had developed with the Air Force that would provide 4th Armored with responsive reconnaissance surveillance and target acquisition, as well as effective close air support and battlefield air interdiction. Even though the 19th Tactical Air Command had less fighters to allocate for close air support, they were still able to guide the division around enemy strongpoints and into key areas in the enemy rear. 6 days after their first repulse, 12th Corps had stockpiled enough fuel and ammunition to attack with all three divisions. Major General Eddy decided to use the indirect approach and use deep battle tactics, which entailed bypassing enemy strongpoints, attacking enemy weakness, and getting behind the enemy. Even by the time of World War II, some of Sun Tzu's principles had been integrated into U.S. Army field manuals. The lessons were learned by spilling precious blood on previous battlefields and tactical exercises. Whether Eddy knew about Sun Tzu or not, he implemented some of his maxims. Avoid strength and strike weakness. Another way Sun Tzu explained it was like this: as water seeks the easiest path to the sea, so armies should avoid obstacles and seek avenues of least resistance. The general should find a way to achieve his goals indirectly, not by direct confrontation. One should move around the enemy to cut him off from retreat, or to attack some point that he cannot afford to lose, like his lines of communication. Eddy knew the Germans had good defensive terrain in front of and near Nancy. He attacked in unexpected and lightly defended areas, but this time he used proper planning, better coordination, combined arms, and surprise to achieve his goals. Plus, this time he had an extra division. The final 12th Corps plan had a start date of September 11th. 80th Infantry Division would attack in the north and the 35th in the south, along with the 4th Armored's Combat Command B. Combat Command A and R, which will use the acronym CCA and CCR from now on, would both wait in reserve to exploit either flank. This would divide the American forces and bypass Nancy altogether. Because of the good defensive terrain held by the German forces, extra support was called in. On September 10th, the day before the main attack, 9th Bomber Command destroyed a bridge at Custine to prevent enemy reinforcements arriving from Nancy. Before 12th Corps' attack had even started, most of the German area reserves had already been sent north to engage 20th Corps. In the south, the 35th Division moved into position and prepared to assault a bridge across the Moselle. In order to throw the Germans off from their real intentions, artillery and airstrikes were primarily directed at the earlier northernmost attack point on the first day of the assault. The 317th Infantry crossed first, 4 miles south, and secured a foothold. Poor roads and enemy resistance slowed the effort in the south. The 134th Infantry Regiment was given permission to assault the bridge at dusk, and although they succeeded in capturing it and establishing a bridgehead, reinforcements failed to arrive. The Americans defeated 2 German infantry attacks, but the bridge was subsequently destroyed by German artillery early the next morning. The Americans were forced back across the river by a 3rd German counterattack supported by tanks, suffering heavy losses. This loss prevented the 134th from being further involved in the attempt to secure a crossing site. As luck would have it, in the north, the Americans attacked on the boundary between the 3rd Panzer Grenadier and the 553rd Grenadier Divisions, which was thinly defended. At this point, the northern attack was making better progress, so CCA moved north. CCA consisted of a reconnaissance troop, a tank battalion, an armored infantry battalion, an infantry battalion borrowed from Eddy's division, 3 artillery battalions, and a reinforced engineer battalion. CCA carried enough supplies for 7 days of independent operations. CCB managed to cross the Moselle in the south. The 137th Infantry also managed to secure a foothold across the Moselle after a feint 5 miles to the north and a half-hour artillery bombardment. They quickly found themselves pinned down after crossing, but were able to fight themselves out after German forces were depleted following a failed counterattack. In order to throw the Americans back in the north, the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division counterattacked at 1 a.m. on September 13th, trying to destroy the bridgehead. It was initially successful and forced an American retreat and pushed them almost back to the bridge itself. An American battalion commander assembled enough troops and tanks of the 702nd Tank Battalion to stop the Germans. After a little more fighting, daylight found the Germans retreating to the north and the east, and the Americans were right on their heels. This allowed the rest of CCA to cross and move on to Chateau Celine, about 20 miles away. As an interesting side note, Lieutenant Colonel Abrams, the same one the modern Abrams tank is named after, was involved in this battle as commander of CCA's 37th Tank Battalion. He pushed across the bridgehead and rapidly moved to the southeast, defeating German roadblocks and taking prisoners. The drive of Abrams' 37th Tank Battalion on September 13th reached a village 3 miles west of Chateau Celine. The next day, orders were changed and CCA was instead to capture the high ground at Ericourt, trying to cut off the German escape routes from Nancy. On arrival in the area, CCA encountered and dispatched forces from the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division with only light casualties, then proceeded to set up a defensive position towards the east from which they were able to harass German forces on the main road to Nancy and send out patrols and conduct raids. This was very successful, as CCA took over 400 prisoners, destroyed over 160 vehicles, and knocked out 10 88mm guns. The assault around Nancy hastened the German withdrawal from the city, which had already been authorized on September 13th by General Oberst Johannes Blaskowitz, the Army Group commander. After meeting little enemy resistance, CCA reached its objective by evening, the high ground near Chateau Celine, which was far in the enemy rear. The cost of the Germans was 354 prisoners, 12 tanks, 85 vehicles, and 5 guns. CCA had only lost 13 dead and 16 wounded. CCA occupied a defensive position that night, waiting for its rear echelons to catch up. By morning, it was supplied and prepared to continue the attack. CCA moved on from Chateau Celine and continued to Ericourt, cutting the German lines of communications to Nancy. CCA then occupied a blocking position near Ericourt, and in the process captured an additional 400 POWs and 26 armored vehicles. 136 other vehicles were destroyed along with 10 88s. CCA had sustained a total of 33 casualties and lost 2 tanks. From Ericourt, CCA conducted a bold series of raids and ambushes that captured and killed another 1,000 enemy soldiers and destroyed almost 300 vehicles. Its operation east of Nancy was so successful that the 553rd Grenadier Division was forced to withdraw from Nancy, leaving it open for occupation by the 35th Division. After CCB crossed the Moselle River in the south, the German defenders retreated to the forest across a nearby river. The Germans had little time to prepare their defenses in the area, and were soon driven off by CCB on September 14th, the bulk of them falling back to Luneville. CCA and CCB met for the first time, thus completing the encirclement of Nancy. 319th Infantry was prepared to advance on Nancy proper. Intelligence provided by the French forces of the interior informed the U.S. troops that the Germans had moved on. On September 15th, the 3rd Battalion of the 319th Infantry Regiment entered Nancy. Resistance by the 553rd Grenadier Division stiffened again, and both the 320th and 137th Infantry Regiments found themselves under heavy fire. The link-up of CCA and CCB was made on September 16th, 3.5 days after crossing the Moselle River north of Nancy. Its organization for combat gave it the flexibility needed for this type of operation. It relied heavily on air units to provide close air support and aerial reconnaissance. Bold leadership, solid operating procedures, and agility allowed the 4th Armored Division to rout a superior force and win a tactical victory. The physical and surprise effect of the 4th Armored Division in the enemy rear resulted in the enemy's collapse at Nancy. The risk in this case was also high, but by applying 4th Armored Division to the rear of the enemy versus a frontal assault on the strong points around Nancy were again worth the risk. The capture of Nancy provided the Allies an important communications center in France, and the city later served as the garrison of 3rd Army headquarters. The German defenders of Nancy, however, largely escaped the encirclement of the city and were available for future operations. The 12th Corps' successful assault across the Moselle River around Nancy also prompted the subsequent German counterattack at Ercourt by 5th Panzer Army, but that's another story for another time. If you liked the video you just watched, then you may like these 2 other videos from EmersusTech.